Welcome back to the HDR Masterclass. In the previous segment, I talked about the general workflow of tone mapping, and during that segment I think maybe you've gotten a pretty good appreciation for the general idea of what it is that we're trying to accomplish with tone mapping. And I did mention that the tone mapping term is a little bit misleading because it suggests that all we're really doing is converting the 32-bit image so that it displays properly on an 8-bit display medium. Well, I think as you recall, there is actually a lot more to it. The tone mapping phase or the stage gives us an opportunity to apply many attributes to our image so that we can control things like noise and contrast, and we can modify colors, and we can adjust the tones, and there's a lot of things that we can do during the tone mapping process, often referred to as the post-processing stage. And I think you also appreciate that coming home to to tone mapping with a very good capture sequence, in which has made an effort to capture all of the light levels in a particular scene, and also strives to achieve the best possible quality, so that during your 32-bit merging we have the greatest possible retention of detail within the scene. We have the best possible avoidance of camera shake and objects moving in the scene, and various other things that can actually damage your 32-bit merged image. Now, let's talk about tone mapping in more depth. Let's start by taking a look at the process which is called image sequence alignment. And really, it's a process of taking your multiple 8-bit captures. It could be 2, 3, 5, 7, 9 captures, but the number of captures is really not important here. What is important is that all of these captured images do need to be merged together. And the point and the purpose of merging is so that you actually have a single file or a single image that you're going to be working with from that point forward. Now, most of your HDR software will actually have a merging step. Typically, it is the first step that you'll complete. Oh, now keep in mind that this merging really doesn't apply when you're trying to work with a single captured image, and that's quite possible. You may actually be in the field and the dynamic range capability of your camera is able to pick up, capture all of the light levels within that scene with a single frame, and that's perfectly fine. There's nothing saying that you have to do a multiple capture. But in many cases in HDR, you're going to wind up needing to do a multiple capture sequence because the light levels within the scene are greater than your camera's ability to capture all of those light levels with a single frame. So this is why the merging portion of the HDR tone mapping workflow comes into play. Now, I am not so much concerned with the very, very specifics of Photomatix Pro, which is what we're using here in this course. I'm more concerned with impressing upon you that there is a merging step. Typically, it's the first thing you do. And during that merging step, you're going to do a couple things. You're going to utilize the capability of the HDR software, whatever brand or make it is, to handle a situation where you may have ghosting within the scene. And ghosting is really, as I had explained in the previous segment and just in review, ghosting is a situation where you have something in the scene that has moved, or it's in a different position, well, a position within your frame, from one capture to the next. When those are merged, you tend to replicate that object in two different places within the merged image file. And we don't want that. That's very difficult to clean up and to deal with. You certainly can, but basically your merge sequence is damaged. So the most HDR software will help you to deal with or mitigate the effect of ghosting, which is an image that is moved from one frame to the next. So just leave it at that. The process of merging will very often handle the ghosting situation. It's going to be slightly different depending upon the HDR software that you're using, but still, that's an important element. The other thing, too, that's going to happen during your merging process is a thing called alignment. Now, you could have, let's just take one frame, all right, and let's say that you're using the AEB, automatic exposure bracket, where your camera is doing multiple shots and the camera is handling, making the adjustments from one shot to the next. Well, you could easily have your scene is encapsulated from here, but in the next shot, even with an AEB, for whatever reason, maybe there was a slight gust of wind, or the mirrors flapped up, or it could be any number of things. But anyway, one frame to the next is slightly different in terms of the total frame. All right. During the tone mapping merging process, there's a thing called alignment. And the idea is the software will look at the pixels within each of those frames and attempt to align them to one another so that your final image is as stable as possible, and where the alignment of the, say, 3 images has been brought in so that all of your lines within the scenes are basically straight. They're not misaligned from one another. Alignment and ghosting are really two different concepts. The point is that during the merging process with most of your HDR software, there's 2 things that are attempting to be done, or 3 things I should say. First is obviously merging your multiple 8-bit images into a single 32-bit HDR high dynamic range image. Second thing is that there is that alignment that is trying to be dealt with so that you don't have pixels that are misaligned with one another from one image to the next, and also ghosting, which is a situation where you have an element in the scene that has moved and therefore kind of replicates itself across the multiple captures and becomes kind of like a mirror or a dual element within your final. So the process of merging your multiple 8 bits into a 32-bit image file, a single 32-bit image file, alignment and ghosting. Those are the things that are being handled during your merging. So with that point in mind, let's continue on. So the ghosting is actually quite harmful to your image processing. You really want to try to avoid it. Different software will have different user interface functionality. This happens to be Photomatix Pro. Photomatix Pro is quite good at handling or mitigating ghosting, and it's important to learn that. Now, you may actually have ghosting, all right, within your 32-bit merged file. You may actually have some ghosting there, and you don't think you do. All it takes is just for a single branch in a tree to be in a slightly different place because of maybe a very subtle wind gust or something. And in the field, you may not even notice that. All right, but when you're bringing everything, you're bringing your sequence merged together, then all of a sudden now that becomes a problem. So you always want to pay attention to the ghosting or the deghosting functionality during your merging process. Don't assume that everything in that scene is going to be in a solid location. In other words, don't assume that you're going to have a no ghosting situation. Assume that you will, and you're always going to be better off. Now, I've made reference to the HDR, the dot or the period HDR. It's a file format that is enabling the pixel information to be represented as 32-bit. And so you have an image file that has a very, very large latitude of information that you're going to be working with as you proceed in your tone mapping. So just keep that in mind, that you're going to wind up with a 32-bit file. You don't necessarily want to throw that away at the end of the workflow while you're working with your tone mapping. You're actually going to be able to, you don't have to, but you're able to actually save off that 32-bit image file that with most HDR software you can pick up later and open that, recall that file, and do another variation of your final image. So it's important to understand that you're going to get a 32-bit actual file that you don't necessarily want to throw away. Okay. Now, what I like to do, and what I always suggest is, when your merging is done, your alignment is done, your deghosting is done, and then your 32-bit file is created by the HDR software, you're going to come up on a point where now it's time to actually begin working with the file, with the image itself. What I like to do is I like to start with the default settings. They give you a number of presets. Most HDR software will give you some number of presets. I like to start with the default. And the default doesn't necessarily mean anything. It's not necessarily creative default or realistic default. It's just a place to start. What I like to do is I like to start with the default preset because it gives me a starting point. And that really is the key. You're kind of a clean slate. Not necessarily what you're going to want in the end, but it's a place to start. All right? I don't really like to start working with my HDR processing, tone mapping. I don't like to start with the very creative defaults. I like to start with the factory determined default, and that gives me a good place to start. All right, and you can almost think of it as a minimum place to start because you're going to be able to control a lot of attributes of the image as you move along. All right, and but you know, the presets do allow you to decide where you're going to start. So it's up to you. If starting with the default works for you, go for it. If starting with maybe a grunge default is what you want to do, that's fine too. And starting with a maybe a grayscale default, that's fine too. It really is entirely up to you. HDR software gives you that flexibility. I just like to start with a nice, basically a default. I don't like to necessarily create. By the way, I rarely actually end with the default. I don't just do the merging, alignment, deghosting, and then pick the default and then say, I like that and go with that. I don't do that. I will fuss with the image, I'll tweak it, I'll experiment, I'll kind of learn some of my possibilities with that particular image based upon that particular scene. I rarely actually end with and agree with the default setting, but I always use it as a starting point. And you know, you have many presets, more or less, depending upon the software, the HDR software that you choose to utilize. But it does give you a really good place to start, and you could be creative. It allows you to experiment. You get to decide, and that's the beauty of most HDR software, is it puts the control in your hands for what you're going to do with that image. Now, we're going to be talking about Photomatix in this particular course, all right? And just really briefly, this is oh, sorry about that. Let's erase that. This is Photomatix, all right, on the screen. You'll notice here that it's kind of divided up into sections or areas. That is the adjustment panel. And over here, this is the preset panel. All right, that's the preview. All right, and so you're actually getting like a live, as you make your adjustments over in the adjustments panel, you're actually being able to see in real time what that image is looking like. And then, of course, you have the histogram, which is also quite important. And as you recall, the histogram is showing you where clipping is occurring, if clipping is occurring. And it's also showing you where your tonal values are in terms of, if you recall, that is your light intensity and distribution across your pixel, all of the pixels within your frame. All right. Now, we are going to take a little bit of break here, and when we return, we're actually going to be going down through the adjustments panel of Photomatix Pro, and I'm going to be talking about each one of these adjustments. We're gonna take our time on that. That's why I want to break right now, and then when we come back in the next segment, you can kind of settle down, and we can take a look at each one of these to get a sense for the kind of control that you have as you're working with your 32-bit aligned and deghosted image based upon a preset that you perhaps have chosen. And you'll notice here, well, I don't expect you to know this, but I'm telling you this, the panel that I'm going to be starting with here, that's the default settings. So we're going to be starting with the Photomatix Pro default, and then we'll talk about each one of these controls here. And then that will give us a good foundation to be able to move forward and get you to a point where you have some sense as to what it is that you're going to be doing and the kind of control that you have over contrast and noise and color and other attributes of your image. So, as you recall now, tone mapping is more than taking a 32-bit and making it displayable on an 8-bit medium. This gives you a lot of control. So that's what we'll talk about next. So take a little bit breather here, and I'm going to see you again in the next segment where we're going to be talking about the settings in Photomatix Pro. I'll see you there.